So we humans have a two-dimensional retina. We have a lens, so this is kind of an eyeball. So objects or points in 3D space come through that lens and are projected on this two-dimensional retina. Now, when people talk about 3D graphics and projections, they often draw it like this, where these 3D points project. We have an eye point, and then we have a plane, a two-dimensional plane that we project these points on. Now, you might notice that this is different, right? Here we seem to have this crossover point here, and they're flipped. Here we have the plane behind the point, whereas in 3D graphics we usually put the plane in front. But it ends up being exactly the same. If this distance is the same as this distance, then put the plane back here, it ends up with the points. I didn't draw this very well, but the points end up being exactly the same, except flipped, right? You may have heard people talk about how the image on your retina is actually like upside down or something. But you end up with basically the same image. And so there's not really a difference. It's easier to think about it in 3D graphics projections, to think about it with the plane up there in front, especially because then we can move it forward and back and do things with it if we want to. Now, in 4 dimensions, whereas in 3 dimensions we have a 2-dimensional retina, in a 4-dimensional being would have some kind of 3-dimensional retina. Now, it might be a sphere, it might be a cube. I would guess sphere. Sphere kind of makes more sense to me. But when we talk about projecting, either one works similarly. So now we have 4-dimensional points out here. And we're going to project them, and we have an eye point. Kind of this is where our focal point is. And we're going to project them onto the sphere, or you could use a cube. Either one is fine. And wherever it crosses that or intersects that sphere, that will be where it's projected to. So, because this is a 3-dimensional sphere that we're projecting it onto, or a 3-dimensional cube, not a 4-dimensional one. So that reduces the dimension. We've got 4 dimensions in the point. We're going to reduce it to 3 dimensions inside this 3D cube or this 3D sphere. Now you might ask, well, wait a minute. A line going through a sphere, couldn't it be a line, right? Couldn't the intersection not be a point? It would only be a line. But what we would find, if you look back at the 3D case, we can explain why that could never happen. In the 3D case, the equivalent of could there ever be a line intersection in this plane? Well, not really, right? Because this point has to go to that point. So we have to have a line between something out in the world and this focal point. The only way we could have a line in this plane is if it was going parallel to it. So in this case, vertical, right? But a vertical line would never intersect with this point. And so that's not going to be a projection ever. So similarly, in the 4-dimensional case, we're just going to get 1 point for an intersection. It's analogous to that. So we're always just going to get 1 point for the intersection. And then once we have this projected onto this 3D situation, well, now we're kind of back to here. So in the overall scheme of things, trying to give a human the experience of 4 dimensions is a 2-step process. First, we project it into a 3-dimensional volume. And then we need to take that 3-dimensional volume and then make it into something we can put onto a screen, computer screen. And so we can take this set of points or images or whatever, however we projected these in, right? And then we're here. and we can project that onto a two-dimensional plane and render that on the screen. Now, what comes into an interesting case here, well, we've got two different points here. We've got the focal point of 4 dimensions. This is kind of our location. This is where our eye is. So we have that focal point, but then we need a point of view to look at this three-dimensional volume. And that gets interesting because it's kind of arbitrary. And it's kind of all around, right? Because however we want to look at this in the 3D space, if we want to move our eye over here or there or down here, so here, there, we're still viewing what is in the three-dimensional retina. We're still viewing it, we're just viewing it from a different perspective. But it's still the same information. It's the same imagery. But since it's 3D, we can look at it from different sides because we can project it onto different eyes in the 3D space. So the choice of that, where to view it from in the 3D space, is kind of an interesting choice. And typically we, something of the equivalent of this eye point, or we could even move it around and have it dynamic. And so as the 4D world is moving around, we move our view of it around, and that would get really confusing really fast now, wouldn't it? So this is kind of a summary of how this two-step process and why 4D is kind of so weird and hard to visualize is because we've got to reduce by 2 dimensions now in order to view it on our screens, computer screens. So we're losing a lot of information. And so the trick then is, how do we somehow make that information available to the viewer and not lost? And typically in 3 dimensions, right, we take this distance, we use a perspective projection, and so things that are far away look smaller. Well, we can do the same thing here, right? We can do a perspective projection in the 4-dimensional space, which is kind of what I've drawn here, because there's a single focal point. This is a perspective projection in 3D because there's a single focal point. Orthographic would be if we just straight lines across, but we're not doing that. And this is the approach I took, is a perspective projection in the 4 dimensions, because that way things that are legitimately farther away are going to be smaller. But then the 3D perspective, the 3D projection onto the 2D screen, I thought it might make more sense to try an orthographic projection. And I might try different things over time and see which one works out best. But my concern over doing another perspective projection here would give you kind of this false idea that things are getting smaller, but they're not actually farther away in 4D. I don't think that would be an accurate representation that we would want to do.